Previously, we learned about saving our brand new models using callback functions or callback handlers. Now, if you've been studying JavaScript, you'll realize that callback handlers, they're still appropriate, they're still perfectly acceptable, but as we get more complex with our callbacks, we end up running into callback hell, where we have callbacks within callbacks within callbacks. Now, we haven't run into that yet, but we could run into that as we're dealing with Mongoose and Mongo. So the Mongoose library has provided us with the ability to use promises instead of callback handlers. So in this video, we are going to replicate saving a new user, but we are going to do it instead of with a callback handler, which we have right here, we are going to do it using promises. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. Now, traditional save, it expects us to pass the callback handler. To use promises, we use a new function at the end of calling save that actually builds a promise and returns to us a promise that will then handle that rejection or completion of the promise. And we do that, so let's go ahead and note here that we are saving using promises. Now, the code is going to be very similar to this, but instead of the potential for callbacks within callbacks within callbacks and handling the error inside of the callback, we're going to use the standard promise syntax where we say let save underscore promise equal, and we're going to do our new user dot save like we did above, but instead of passing a callback handler, we are just going to pass the keyword save. And when we do save, it will send back a promise object where we can then handle the promise. So let's do console.log, and we are going to verify that this is really a promise that returned is a promise. And this is just for us so that we can see that we really are getting a promise back when we call save. So let's do save underscore promise, which of course is our promise object that we got back from the call to save where we didn't pass a handler. And I'm just going to say instance of, and then the keyword promise, that particular data type in JavaScript. And this will give us either a true or false, because it's going to check to see what this is an instance of. If it is an instance of promise, we should get a true. So it should say is promise true if we're getting a promise back. Now, when we handle promises, we go ahead and use our save promise, and we use the .then handler right there. So I'm going to go ahead and move that to the next line so we can see it clearly. And then to catch errors, instead of .then, instead of doing it within a handler function, we use the catch, because catch is going to throw an error if there is an error. Now, inside of the then, we know that it was successful. There was no error. And inside of the catch, we know there was a failure. So we're going to handle them separately instead of in the same block of code like we did in the handler right there. So in then, we know we got our user back. It's good. So let's go ahead and call it saved user. And we're using an anonymous arrow function right here as our handler for the successful case. And just like we did up here, we know it was a successful save. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. We're going to uncomment this. And we have our saved user. And we're going to pull out the ID, and then we're going to log the actual user document. Now, if it's a failure, we're going to get an error back, which means we're going to get this error right here. But instead of needing to say if error and then doing the return here, we actually, now that we know it is for sure an error if it comes down in here, we again can use an anonymous arrow function, and we can simply log the error. So hopefully you can see that this kind of separates the concerns. It separates the concerns of handling an error as well as handling the successful case. We have our successful case here, we have our error here, and our code is separated. This gets rid of the need for checking if there is an error and returning if we do get an error so that this code won't run. Instead, it's all separated out into its own cases. Now we can go ahead and test and see if our promise is actually going to work. So let's go ahead and start our debugger. Oh, we didn't do a breakpoint. Let's open up our terminal so we can see what's happening. Let's go to our debug console. Oh, we got an error here. You can see we got a duplicate key error, and that is because, of course, we have a duplicate email address, because the last time we did a B test, we already have the B test in there. So we need to come back up here and let's change this to C test. And then let's put a breakpoint right here and then a breakpoint right here. Now let's go ahead and restart our debugger. And here we've got our saved user. We know it's a successful case here because we've got no errors in our object and C test. That means it was successful. Now let's go ahead and let's look at our database and see if we got our C in there. We got our B test, and here's our C test. Now, of course, if we try to run this again, we should get an error this time. And of course, our error says we've got a duplicate because we already used the email C test. So we'll go ahead and click play. Let's go ahead and change it again to ABCD. We'll do D test. We will go ahead and run this again. So let's restart it. Now it's successful. We got a saved user ID right here. And it is a promise. Let's go back to our database. Let's see what we got here. And we have ourselves a D test. All right. Okay. So we see that our promises work. We see that we are now saving data. We're handling the cases where we have a failure, and then the cases where we have success. And we have now saved users successfully using the promise syntax for handling the save.